Imagine a weapon so powerful that it turned a tiny nation into a global superpower overnight. A secret so valuable that kings would kill to possess it, and admirals would die to protect it. For over a century, Portugal guarded this naval innovation with their lives, while the greatest minds in Europe desperately tried to steal it. What was this game-changing secret? It wasn't a cannon, it wasn't gunpowder, and it definitely wasn't what you think. Today, I'm revealing the Portuguese naval secret that rewrote the rules of maritime warfare and changed the course of human history forever. But before we dive into this incredible story, if you love uncovering hidden historical secrets like this, smash that subscribe button and hit the like. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Let me take you back to the early 1400s. Picture the European coastline, dotted with ports and harbors where massive ships sit anchored, their crews frustrated, their captains desperate. These weren't just any ships. These were the pride of European naval engineering, the culmination of centuries of maritime development. And yet, they were utterly inadequate for what was coming next. You see, for centuries, European shipbuilding had evolved along a very specific path. The Mediterranean powers, particularly the Italian city-states and the Byzantine Empire, had perfected the galley, a long, sleek vessel powered primarily by oars with auxiliary sails. These ships were perfect for the calm, predictable waters of the Mediterranean Sea. They could maneuver in battle, maintain course regardless of wind conditions, and coastal hop with remarkable efficiency. But galleys had fatal flaws. They required enormous crews, sometimes hundreds of rowers, which meant carrying massive amounts of food and water. They couldn't venture far from shore without resupply. They were expensive to operate and maintain, and most critically, they were absolutely terrible in rough seas. The moment you took a galley out into the Atlantic Ocean, with its unpredictable storms, massive swells, and violent weather patterns, you were essentially sailing a death trap. The Northern European powers, particularly the Hanseatic League and English merchants, had developed a different solution: the cog. The cog was a sturdy, round-bellied sailing vessel with a single square sail. It was perfect for carrying cargo through the rough waters of the North Sea and Baltic. It could handle bad weather, it didn't require hundreds of rowers, and it was relatively economical to operate. But the cog had its own devastating limitations. It could only sail effectively with the wind behind it, or at best at a slight angle. Sailing into the wind, or beating to windward as sailors call it, was nearly impossible. This meant that if the wind wasn't favorable, you simply waited. Days, sometimes weeks, sitting in port or at anchor, waiting for conditions to change. In an age where time meant money and control meant power, this was unacceptable. And here's where the problem became critical. By the early 15th century, Europe was facing a crisis. The traditional trade routes to the east, to the spices and silks and treasures of India and China, were increasingly controlled by hostile powers. The Ottoman Empire was expanding, making the old Silk Road routes dangerous and expensive. European merchants were paying outrageous prices to Muslim middlemen for goods that originated thousands of miles away. The solution seemed obvious: find a sea route. Sail around Africa, or perhaps west across the Atlantic. Bypass the middlemen entirely and go directly to the source. But here's the thing: nobody could do it. The ships that could handle ocean conditions couldn't sail effectively into the wind. The ships that could maneuver couldn't handle rough seas. It was an impossible problem, a technological dead end. European shipwrights tried everything. They experimented with multiple masts, different sail configurations, various hull designs. Nothing worked. The fundamental problem remained. You couldn't build a ship that was both seaworthy enough for ocean exploration and maneuverable enough to sail against unfavorable winds. This wasn't just an engineering challenge. This was a question of national survival and continental dominance. Whichever nation solved this problem first would have access to unimaginable wealth. They could establish direct trade routes to Asia. They could discover new lands. They could bypass all the traditional powers and rewrite the economic map of the world. And every major power knew it. Spanish shipwrights were working on the problem. Italian designers were experimenting. English craftsmen were building prototypes. French engineers were calculating angles and forces. Across Europe, in every major port, the best minds were focused on this single challenge. Build a ship that can sail anywhere, in any condition, regardless of wind direction. They all failed. Every single one of them. The breakthrough wouldn't come from the established maritime powers. It wouldn't come from the wealthy Italian city-states with their centuries of naval tradition. It wouldn't come from the sophisticated French or the pragmatic English. It would come from a small kingdom on the edge of Europe, a place most people considered a backwater, a nation so poor that its nobles often couldn't afford decent armor. It would come from Portugal. And the solution they developed would be so revolutionary, so far ahead of its time, that it would take the rest of Europe more than a century to fully understand and replicate it. But why Portugal? What made this small, relatively poor nation the birthplace of the most important maritime innovation in human history? To understand that, we need to look at Portugal's unique and desperate situation. Portugal in the early 1400s was not what you'd call a promising candidate for global domination. Let me paint you a picture of just how challenging Portugal's position really was. Geographically, Portugal was stuck, literally. Imagine being a medieval kingdom with ambitions for trade and expansion, but you only have one neighbor, and that neighbor is Spain. Not just any Spain, but a Spain that was larger, wealthier, more populous, and had better resources. The entire eastern border of Portugal was Spanish territory. Your only other direction was west, toward the Atlantic Ocean. Now, the Atlantic in the 15th century wasn't seen as an opportunity. It was seen as a dead end, a barrier, the edge of the known world. Medieval maps literally showed sea monsters and warnings beyond the Atlantic coast. "Here be dragons" wasn't just a cute saying. It represented genuine fear of the unknown. Portugal's economy was struggling. They didn't have the vast agricultural lands of France. They didn't have the rich trading cities of Italy. They didn't have the mineral wealth of Spain or the commercial networks of the Hanseatic League. What they had was fish, salt, and not much else. Portuguese nobles were famously poor by European standards. There are records of Portuguese aristocrats showing up at international gatherings in armor that was practically falling apart, while their Spanish, French, and English counterparts wore gleaming plate mail. But poverty, as it turns out, can be a powerful motivator. When you have nowhere to go but the ocean and nothing to lose but your poverty, you start thinking differently about that ocean. And Portugal had something else, something far more valuable than wealth. They had necessity, vision, and a unique set of circumstances that forced innovation. Enter Prince Henry the Navigator. Now, despite his famous nickname, Henry wasn't actually a navigator and didn't go on most of these voyages himself. But what he was a obsessed visionary with resources and determination. Henry understood something that most European rulers didn't. The future belonged to whoever could master ocean navigation. Henry established what was essentially the world's first research and development center for maritime technology in Sagres, on the southwestern tip of Portugal. He gathered the best minds he could find: shipwrights, navigators, cartographers, astronomers, even Muslim and Jewish scholars who had knowledge of mathematics and astronomy that Christian Europe had largely forgotten. But here's what made Portugal's situation unique and ultimately advantageous. They had access to multiple maritime traditions. Remember, Portugal was right at the intersection of the Mediterranean and Atlantic worlds. Portuguese sailors had experience with both the Mediterranean galley tradition and the Northern European cog tradition. They could see the advantages and disadvantages of both systems firsthand. Moreover, Portugal had a strong maritime culture born of necessity. Portuguese fishermen had been venturing farther and farther into the Atlantic for centuries, developing practical knowledge about ocean conditions, wind patterns, and wave behavior that landlocked nations simply didn't have. These weren't theoretical scholars debating in universities. These were practical men who had survived Atlantic storms and lived to tell about it. Portugal also had a strategic advantage in terms of prevailing winds. The wind patterns off the Portuguese coast are complex and variable, which meant Portuguese sailors had to develop real skill in handling different conditions. They couldn't rely on consistent trade winds like Caribbean sailors would later. They had to learn to sail in whatever conditions they encountered. And finally, Portugal had motivation that went beyond simple profit. After centuries of fighting Muslim kingdoms during the Reconquista, Portugal saw itself as a crusading nation. The idea of sailing around Africa to attack Muslim kingdoms from behind, or finding the legendary Christian kingdom of Prester John to ally with, wasn't just about trade. It was about faith, about destiny, about Portugal's place in divine history. All these factors created a perfect storm of innovation. You had necessity, you had practical experience, you had access to multiple knowledge traditions, you had institutional support from Prince Henry, and you had motivation that went beyond simple economics. And out of this unique cauldron emerged something revolutionary. Portuguese shipwrights, working in small yards along the coast, began experimenting with a radical new design. They took the best elements from both the Mediterranean and Atlantic traditions, added their own innovations based on practical experience, and created something that had never existed before. They created the caravel, and with it, they created the future. Now we get to the heart of the matter. What exactly was this Portuguese secret? What made the caravel so revolutionary that it would dominate ocean exploration for over a century? Let me start by saying this. If you showed a caravel to a modern person, they probably wouldn't be that impressed. It's not a massive ship. Early caravels were actually quite small, maybe 50 to 70 feet long, with a crew of only 20 to 30 men. Compared to the great ships of later eras, or even some contemporary Mediterranean vessels, caravels looked almost insignificant. But size isn't what mattered. What mattered was capability, and the caravel had capabilities that no other ship in the world could match. First, let's talk about the hull design. Portuguese shipwrights developed a hull shape that was unlike anything Europe had seen before. It was relatively narrow and sleek compared to the round-bellied cogs of northern Europe, but not as extreme as the Mediterranean galleys. The Portuguese developed a specific ratio of length to beam that created a hull that could cut through ocean waves rather than riding over them. More importantly, they designed a hull that was both strong enough to handle Atlantic conditions and light enough to be maneuverable. They achieved this through a sophisticated system of framing and planking. Unlike the clinker-built ships of northern Europe, where planks overlapped like shingles on a roof, the Portuguese used caravel planking, where planks were laid edge to edge on a strong internal frame. This created a smoother hull with less water resistance. It also created a stronger structure that could better withstand the twisting forces of ocean waves. And critically, it created a hull that was lighter for its size, which meant better speed and maneuverability. But the real revolution was in the sail configuration. This is where the Portuguese absolutely transformed maritime technology, and this is the secret they guarded most carefully. Traditional European ships use square sails. A square sail is basically a rectangular piece of canvas that hangs from a horizontal yard perpendicular to the mast. Square sails are excellent for sailing with the wind behind you. They can catch a following wind and push a ship along at good speed, but they're terrible for sailing at an angle to the wind and essentially useless for sailing into the wind. The Mediterranean tradition had developed lateen sails, triangular sails that hung from a long diagonal yard. Lateen sails were much better for maneuvering and could sail at a sharper angle to the wind. But they had their own problems. They were difficult to handle, especially in strong winds. They required more crew to operate, and they weren't as efficient as square sails when running before the wind. The Portuguese solution was brilliant in its flexibility. They developed a caravel design that could use both types of sails and could switch between them depending on conditions. This was called the caravel redonda when using square sails, and caravel latina when using lateen sails. But even more revolutionary, they developed ways to combine both types of sails on the same ship. A typical Portuguese caravel might have 2 or 3 masts. The forward masts could carry square sails for power when running with the wind, while the rear mast carried a lateen sail for maneuverability and the ability to sail closer to the wind. This combination meant that a caravel could sail effectively in almost any wind condition. But here's where it gets really technical and really important. The Portuguese didn't just combine existing sail types, they refined them. They experimented with different sizes, different shapes, different materials. They developed new rigging techniques that allowed for faster sail changes. They created systems that let a small crew handle relatively large sail areas. Most importantly, they figured out the art of sailing to windward, what sailors call beating or tacking. You see, no ship can sail directly into the wind, but a well-designed ship can sail at an angle to the wind, maybe 45 degrees off. By sailing at an angle, then turning and sailing at an angle in the other direction, then turning back again, you can zigzag your way forward, even though the wind is coming from ahead. This technique was known in theory, but Portuguese sailors perfected it in practice. They learned exactly what angle to sail at for maximum efficiency. They learned how to read the wind and waves to know when to turn. They learned how to trim the sails just right to maintain speed while sailing as close to the wind as possible. And here's what this meant in practical terms. A Portuguese caravel could leave port and sail in almost any direction, regardless of wind. If other ships were stuck in harbour waiting for favourable winds, a caravel could leave anyway. If other ships were blown off course and had to wait for wind changes to return, a caravel could tack back to where it needed to be. For exploration, this was everything. Imagine you're trying to explore the coast of Africa. The prevailing winds along the African coast blow from north to south. Any ship with square sails could sail down the coast easily, pushed by favourable winds. But how do you get back? With traditional ships, you couldn't. You'd have to wait months for wind patterns to change, or row back, or just abandon the voyage. With a caravel, you could sail down the coast and then tack your way back north, sailing at an angle to the wind. It might take longer. It might require skilled seamanship, but it was possible. This single capability made Portuguese exploration of Africa feasible. Without it, the whole enterprise would have been impossible. The Portuguese also developed other innovations that complemented the caravel design. They improved navigation techniques, using astronomical observations to determine latitude. They developed better charts and maps. They created standardized sailing directions, called rutters, that recorded currents, winds, coastal features, and safe anchorages. But the caravel itself remained the key. It was the platform that made everything else possible. It was fast enough to outrun pirates. It was maneuverable enough to explore tricky coastlines. It was seaworthy enough to handle ocean storms. It was economical enough to operate that even relatively poor Portugal could afford to send out multiple expeditions. And it was capable enough that skilled sailors could take it anywhere. The Portuguese had solved the unsolvable problem. They had created a ship that could sail anywhere in any condition with a small crew and modest resources. They had the key to the world's oceans. And they knew exactly how valuable that key was. Which brings us to our next topic. How did they keep this revolutionary technology secret for so long? Keeping a technological secret in the 15th century was no easy task, especially when that secret was a physical object that sailed into ports across the known world. Portuguese caravels were seen by Spanish sailors, Italian merchants, French observers, and English shipwrights. Anyone with eyes could look at a caravel and see that it was different. So how did Portugal manage to keep the specifics of caravel design secret for over a century? The answer is both simpler and more complex than you might think. It wasn't any single measure that protected the secret, but rather a comprehensive system of security, misdirection, and practical difficulty that kept other nations from successfully copying Portuguese designs. First, let's understand what Portugal was actually protecting. They weren't trying to hide the existence of caravels. That would be impossible. What they were protecting was the precise technical knowledge, the exact hull proportions, the specific rigging configurations, the mathematical ratios that made a caravel work. It's the difference between seeing a Formula One car and understanding exactly how to build one that actually works. Portugal's first line of defense was legal. Portuguese law strictly forbade the export of ship designs, plans, or detailed information about caravel construction. Shipwrights who worked on caravels were required to take oaths of secrecy. Sharing technical information with foreigners was considered treason, punishable by death. These weren't empty threats. There are documented cases of Portuguese shipwrights being executed for selling information to Spanish agents. Moreover, Portugal controlled its shipyards carefully. The most important shipyards were in Portugal itself, particularly in Lisbon, Porto, and Lagos. These yards were closely monitored. Foreign visitors were not allowed. Even Portuguese citizens needed legitimate business to enter. Guards patrolled these facilities, and workers were carefully vetted. But legal restrictions alone wouldn't be enough. Portugal employed more subtle measures as well. They practiced what we might call security through obscurity. Dessus, Portuguese sailors and shipwrights developed their own technical vocabulary, specific terms and phrases for different aspects of caravel design and operation. This jargon served as a kind of code. Even if you overheard Portuguese sailors talking about their ships, you wouldn't necessarily understand what they were actually discussing unless you were part of that maritime culture. Portugal also used misdirection. When foreign observers did get a chance to examine caravels, often what they saw were modified versions used for trade or fishing, not the advanced exploration vessels. The Portuguese maintained different grades of caravels, basic designs for common use and advanced designs reserved for exploration and military purposes. The advanced features were the real secrets, and those ships were kept away from prying eyes as much as possible. There's also the matter of master craftsmen and tacit knowledge. Building a proper caravel wasn't just about following a set of plans. It required skills and judgment that were passed down master to apprentice through years of hands-on training. How much should you curve this timber? How should you set that angle? When is the wood properly seasoned? These weren't things you could write down easily or learn from stolen documents. They were skills that lived in the hands and eyes of experienced craftsmen. Portuguese shipyards cultivated this knowledge carefully. Apprenticeships were long and thorough. Master shipwrights were respected figures who jealously guarded their knowledge and only passed it on to trusted apprentices, often family members. This created a professional culture where knowledge was precious and protected. Portugal also benefited from practical difficulties that other nations faced. Even if you managed to steal or copy caravel designs, could you actually build one? Did you have shipwrights with the necessary skills? Did you have access to the right materials? Portuguese builders preferred certain types of wood that weren't readily available everywhere. They used specific techniques for treating and shaping timber that took years to master. And even if you built something that looked like a caravel, could you sail it properly? Remember, much of the caravel's advantage came from sailing technique. Portuguese sailors had developed specific methods for handling these ships, for trimming the sails, for tacking efficiently, for reading wind and water. This knowledge was as valuable as the ship design itself, and it was even harder to steal because it existed only in the skills and experience of Portuguese crews. The Portuguese crown also employed intelligence measures. They had agents in other European courts who would report on shipbuilding activities and attempts to copy Portuguese designs. If Spain or France or England started a suspicious shipbuilding program, Portugal would hear about it. They could then take countermeasures, diplomatic pressure, spreading false information, even sabotage in extreme cases. Furthermore, Portugal actively spread misinformation. They would deliberately exaggerate the difficulty and danger of ocean sailing. They circulated stories of terrible storms, sea monsters, and mysterious dangers. Some of this was genuine superstition, but some of it was calculated to discourage other nations from attempting what Portugal was doing. If other Europeans believed that sailing the Atlantic was nearly suicidal, they'd be less likely to invest in competing expeditions. Portugal also maintained strict control over maritime information. Charts and maps of Portuguese discoveries were state secrets. Sailing directions were carefully guarded. Information about ocean currents, wind patterns, and safe routes was restricted to Portuguese captains and carefully controlled. The Casa da India in Lisbon became a central repository for all this strategic knowledge, accessible only to authorized individuals. When Portuguese expeditions discovered new lands or routes, the information was classified. Captains were required to report directly to the Crown and were forbidden from sharing details publicly. This meant that while Europe might hear vague stories about Portuguese discoveries, they didn't have the precise information needed to follow the same routes. But perhaps the most effective protection was simply how far ahead Portugal was. By the time other nations started seriously trying to copy caravels, Portugal had been refining the design for decades. They had multiple generations of improvements, learned from thousands of hours of actual ocean sailing. They had solved problems that other nations hadn't even encountered yet. It wasn't just about copying a ship design. It was about closing a gap of accumulated experience and knowledge. Think of it like this. If I gave you detailed plans for a modern fighter jet, could you build one? Even with the plans, you'd need materials, tools, skills, testing facilities, and years of trial and error. Portugal's lead in caravel technology was similar. The gap wasn't impossible to close, but it would take time, resources, and determination. And throughout this period, Portugal wasn't standing still. They continued to improve and refine their designs. By the time other nations started to figure out caravels, Portugal had already moved on to even more advanced ships like the carrack and the galleon, incorporating caravel innovations into larger, more powerful vessels. But no secret lasts forever. Despite Portugal's best efforts, the knowledge began to leak out. And when it did, it transformed the world. Now let's talk about what Portugal actually did with their technological advantage, because the impact was staggering. This wasn't just about having better ships. This was about reshaping the entire world order, creating the first truly global civilization, and initiating changes that we're still living with today. Let me take you through the timeline of Portuguese achievements. And as we go, remember, none of this would have been possible without the caravel. Every single one of these expeditions depended absolutely on having ships that could sail anywhere and return safely. The exploration began cautiously. In the 1420s and 1430s, Portuguese caravels started pushing down the African coast. This doesn't sound dramatic, but understand the context. European ships had barely ventured past Cape Bojador, a point on the western Saharan coast. There were legends that beyond this cape, the ocean boiled, the sun burned black skin even blacker, and ships couldn't return because the winds and currents would trap them. In 1434, Gil Eanes, commanding a caravel, finally sailed past Cape Bojador and returned to report that none of the legends were true. This might have been the single most important voyage in human history that nobody remembers. Eanes proved that the Atlantic was navigable, that caravels could handle ocean conditions, and most importantly, that ships could sail south and then return north against the prevailing winds. The psychological barrier was broken. After that, Portuguese exploration accelerated rapidly. By 1445, they'd reached Cape Verde, the westernmost point of Africa. By 1460, they'd explored the entire western coast of Africa, down to modern Sierra Leone. By 1471, they'd crossed the equator, another psychological barrier. Medieval Europeans believed the equator was a burning zone of fire where life was impossible. Portuguese sailors proved that wrong too. Each of these expeditions was bringing back not just geographical knowledge, but commercial opportunities. The Portuguese discovered gold in West Africa, which was desperately needed by European economies. They established trading posts, creating a commercial network that bypassed traditional middlemen. They began trading directly with African kingdoms, exchanging European manufactured goods for gold, ivory, and eventually slaves, unfortunately. But the real prize was the route to India. If Portugal could sail around Africa, they could reach the spice markets of India and Southeast Asia directly, eliminating the Muslim and Italian middlemen who controlled the traditional routes. This would be worth more than all the gold in Africa. The challenge was immense. The African coast stretches for thousands of miles. The winds and currents are complex and often unfavorable, and nobody knew how far South Africa extended. For all Portuguese explorers knew, Africa might stretch all the way to the South Pole. This is where the caravel truly proved its worth. Year after year, Portuguese expeditions pushed further south, each voyage built on the knowledge of previous ones, carefully mapping coastlines, currents, and wind patterns. They established way stations along the coast where ships could resupply. They learned which times of year had favorable conditions for different segments of the journey. In 1488, Bartolomeu Dias finally rounded the Cape of Good Hope, the southern tip of Africa. Dias proved that Africa had an end, that there was open ocean beyond, and that a ship could sail from the Atlantic into the Indian Ocean. His expedition used caravels exclusively, and without them, the voyage would have been impossible. Then, in 1497, Vasco da Gama led an expedition that completed what generations of Portuguese explorers had been working toward. Da Gama sailed around Africa and reached India, establishing direct contact with the spice markets. This voyage alone made Portugal one of the wealthiest nations in Europe almost overnight. The profit margin on spices was enormous, sometimes 1,000% or more. The ships that returned from India carried cargoes worth more than their weight in gold. But here's what's crucial to understand. Every one of these expeditions was possible only because of the caravel's unique capabilities. Traditional European ships literally could not have made these voyages. The combination of ocean-worthiness, maneuverability, and the ability to sail against unfavorable winds was absolutely essential. Moreover, the caravel's relatively small size and crew requirements meant Portugal could afford to send out multiple expeditions simultaneously and sustain losses when expeditions failed. And they did fail regularly. Ships were wrecked, crews died of disease, expeditions got lost. But Portugal could keep trying because each caravel was a relatively modest investment compared to the potential payoff. The impact went beyond exploration. Portuguese caravels also revolutionized naval warfare. They were fast enough to outrun larger warships and maneuverable enough to choose when and where to engage. Portuguese captains quickly learned to use their advantages. Hit-and-run tactics, fighting at range with cannon, using superior sailing ability to gain advantageous positions. When Portugal wanted to control the Indian Ocean spice trade, they didn't need to conquer entire kingdoms, they just needed to control the sea. Portuguese fleets, using tactics developed for caravels and applied to larger warships, defeated much larger Arab and Indian fleets. At the Battle of Diu in 1509, a small Portuguese fleet destroyed a combined Muslim fleet that outnumbered them significantly, establishing Portuguese naval dominance in the Indian Ocean for nearly a century. This was a new model of empire. Instead of conquering vast territories like ancient empires, Portugal created a network of fortified trading posts and controlled the sea lanes between them. They didn't need to rule millions of people on land. They just needed to control who could sail where and who could trade with whom. It was the world's first maritime commercial empire, and it was built on caravel technology. The economic impact on Portugal was transformative. In a few decades, Portugal went from being one of Europe's poorest kingdoms to one of its wealthiest. Lisbon became one of the richest cities in Europe, filled with exotic goods from Africa, India, and eventually Brazil and Asia. Portuguese merchants grew wealthy beyond measure. The royal treasury was flooded with revenues from the spice trade. But the impact went far beyond Portugal. Portuguese discoveries fundamentally changed European understanding of the world. Medieval world maps had shown a world dominated by Europe, Asia, and a small Africa. Portuguese voyages revealed that Africa was enormous, that there were vast oceans connecting continents, that the world was far larger and more complex than anyone had imagined. This geographical knowledge spread through Europe despite Portuguese attempts to keep it secret. Maps incorporating Portuguese discoveries circulated in educated circles. The knowledge that ocean voyages to distant lands were possible inspired others to try. Christopher Columbus, sailing for Spain, was directly inspired by Portuguese successes. He believed, incorrectly, that he could reach Asia by sailing west because Portuguese voyages had shown that long ocean voyages were survivable. The caravel also enabled the colonization of the Atlantic islands. Portuguese caravels settled the Azores, Madeira, and Cape Verde Islands, creating way stations for Atlantic voyages and establishing profitable sugar plantations. These became models for later European colonization in the Americas. When the Portuguese reached Brazil in 1500, almost by accident, when Pedro Álvares Cabral's India-bound fleet was blown off course, they could establish a presence there because caravels made regular Atlantic crossings feasible. Brazil would eventually become Portugal's largest and most valuable colony, and it was accessible only because of caravel technology. The Portuguese success also triggered a revolution in European cartography, navigation, and maritime technology. Other nations, seeing what Portugal was achieving, invested heavily in developing their own maritime capabilities. This led to rapid advancement in navigation instruments, map-making, ship design, and naval organization. The age of discovery that transformed the world was fundamentally enabled by Portuguese caravel technology. By the mid-16th century, Portuguese explorers and traders had reached China, Japan, Southeast Asia, East Africa, and South America. They had circumnavigated Africa, crossed the Indian Ocean, and established trading posts on 4 continents. A small nation on the edge of Europe had created the first global trade network in human history. And through all of this, from the early cautious voyages down the African coast to the establishment of a global empire, the caravel was the essential tool. It was the technology that made everything possible. Without it, Portuguese exploration would have stalled at Cape Boiador, the spice trade would have remained under traditional control, and the course of world history would have been completely different. But Portugal's monopoly couldn't last forever. Other European nations were desperate to share in these riches and were determined to learn Portugal's secrets. While Portugal was busy building a maritime empire, the rest of Europe was frantically trying to catch up. And let me tell you, this wasn't a casual effort. This was a century-long technological espionage campaign that involved stolen plans, bribed shipwrights, captured vessels, and eventually outright reverse engineering and independent innovation. It's a story of industrial espionage on a scale that wouldn't be matched until the Cold War space race. Spain was, naturally, the most motivated competitor. They shared the Iberian Peninsula with Portugal. They watched Portuguese ships returning with holds full of gold and spices, and they were absolutely determined to get in on the action. The problem was, they didn't have caravels that could match Portuguese performance. Spanish shipyards tried to build caravels based on observation alone. They produced vessels that looked similar from a distance, but the details were wrong. The proportions weren't quite right. The hull shapes didn't perform well in rough seas. The rigging wasn't optimized for tacking efficiency. Spanish captains would take these ships out and discover that they didn't handle like Portuguese caravels. They were slower, less maneuverable, less reliable in bad weather. This must have been incredibly frustrating. Imagine being a Spanish shipwright, looking at a Portuguese caravel tied up in port, measuring what you can with your eyes, trying to figure out exactly what makes it work, and knowing that if you got caught being too curious, you might be arrested as a spy. Because that's exactly what happened to several Spanish agents who were caught skulking around Portuguese shipyards. Spain tried multiple approaches. They offered enormous bounties to Portuguese shipwrights who would defect and share their knowledge. A few took the deal. These defectors would arrive in Spanish shipyards with their knowledge and experience. But here's the problem. Even with expertise, you can't instantly replicate a technological system. Spanish yards didn't have the same materials, the same tools, or the same support craftsmen. Building one good caravel is different from establishing a systematic production capability. Spain also tried capturing Portuguese vessels. In the complex dynastic politics of 15th century Europe, Spain and Portugal went to war several times. Spanish forces would capture Portuguese caravels as prizes. Spanish shipwrights would then carefully examine these captured vessels, measuring every timber, documenting every detail. But here's what they learned. Understanding how something is built isn't the same as understanding why it was built that way. You can measure the angle of a timber, but do you understand the hydrodynamic reasoning behind that angle? You can count the threads in a sail, but do you know why that particular weave was chosen? Reverse engineering is much harder than it looks, especially when you're dealing with a technology that evolved through decades of iterative improvement and practical testing. England faced similar challenges. English shipwrights had centuries of experience building ships for the North Sea and Atlantic fishing grounds. They knew how to build sturdy vessels that could handle rough weather. But the caravel represented a fundamentally different approach to ship design, one that prioritized maneuverability and versatility over pure cargo capacity or raw strength. English attempts to copy Portuguese designs produced hybrid vessels that combined English building traditions with observed Portuguese features. These ships were interesting experiments, but they weren't true caravels. They were heavier, slower, and less nimble than the Portuguese originals. English captains who sailed them reported that they handled reasonably well in familiar English waters, but didn't have the same performance characteristics in different ocean conditions. France, Venice, and Genoa all launched their own efforts. The Italian maritime republics had the most sophisticated shipbuilding traditions in Europe outside of Portugal. Venetian and Genoese shipwrights were masters of their craft, building everything from war galleys to massive merchant carracks. But the caravel was outside their experience. It wasn't a scaled-up or scaled-down version of something they already knew. It was a different paradigm. Italian attempts focused on incorporating caravel features into existing designs. They experimented with lateen sails on different hull types, tried various mast configurations, and tested different rigging systems. Some of these experiments produced useful results. Italian shipbuilders made genuine innovations of their own, but they still couldn't quite replicate the complete package that made Portuguese caravels so effective. What's fascinating is that this wasn't due to lack of intelligence or skill. European shipwrights outside Portugal were highly capable craftsmen. The problem was systemic. Portugal had a complete ecosystem for caravel production, specialized suppliers, experienced craftsmen, established building techniques, institutional knowledge, and decades of accumulated sailing experience. Replicating one element of that system was possible. Replicating the whole system took time. There's also an economic dimension to consider. Building caravels that actually worked required investment in experimentation. You had to build test vessels, sail them extensively, document what worked and what didn't, modify your designs, and repeat the process. This took years and cost substantial money. Portugal had invested in this process over decades, funded by royal support and later by profits from exploration. Other nations had to decide whether to make similar investments. Some did. Spain, particularly after the marriage alliance that would eventually unite the Spanish kingdoms, committed serious resources to maritime development. They brought in Portuguese experts, established new shipyards, and funded experimental programs. Gradually, Spanish caravels improved. By the late 15th century, Spain had caravels that were genuinely competitive with Portuguese designs. But here's the thing. Even when Spain achieved rough parity in ship design, they still lagged behind in accumulated knowledge. Portuguese sailors had decades of experience with Atlantic navigation, wind patterns, current systems, and exploration techniques. Portuguese charts and sailing directions represented an enormous body of practical knowledge. Spanish explorers had to learn many of these lessons themselves, often through dangerous trial and error. This is why Christopher Columbus's voyage in 1492 was such a gamble. Columbus was sailing for Spain with ships that included caravel-type vessels, but he was venturing into completely unknown waters without the benefit of accumulated Portuguese experience. He got lucky, finding the Caribbean islands at a distance that was barely within his ship's range. If the Americas had been even slightly farther away, his expedition would have failed catastrophically. The irony is that Columbus had previously tried to sell his westward voyage idea to Portugal, and Portuguese experts had rejected it, correctly calculating that Asia was far too distant to reach by sailing west. Spain funded Columbus partly because they had less expertise and were more willing to gamble on a long-shot proposition. As the 16th century progressed, the gap began to close more rapidly. This happened for several reasons. First, Portuguese technology inevitably leaked out as more people learned it. Ship captains changed allegiances, craftsmen emigrated, captured vessels were studied more thoroughly, and diplomatic marriages created opportunities for knowledge transfer. Second, other nations developed their own innovations. Spanish shipbuilders, working from a partially understood foundation of caravel technology, made modifications and improvements suited to their own needs. They developed the galleon, which incorporated caravel sailing capabilities into a larger, more heavily armed vessel suitable for both trade and warfare. English shipwrights went in a different direction, creating ships like the race-built galleons that emphasized speed and gun power. These vessels drew on caravel innovations, but adapted them to English tactical and strategic requirements. French, Dutch, and other European maritime powers each developed their own approaches, all influenced by the fundamental breakthrough the Portuguese caravel represented, but adapted to different circumstances and needs. Third, the printing press revolutionized the spread of maritime knowledge. In the early 15th century, technical knowledge was transmitted person to person, master to apprentice. By the mid-16th century, printed books on navigation, ship design, and maritime technology were circulating widely. Portuguese attempts to restrict this information became increasingly futile. By around 1550 to 1580, roughly a century after the caravel's development, European maritime technology had largely converged. Most European nations with serious naval ambitions had ships that incorporated the key caravel innovations: the ability to sail efficiently at various angles to the wind, ocean-worthy hull designs, and flexible sail configurations. The specific secret was no longer secret, but Portugal's head start had given them a century of dominance, a century of profits from the spice trade, a century of geographical discoveries, a century of establishing fortified trading posts around the world. By the time other nations caught up technologically, Portugal had already built an empire. They had established themselves in India, Southeast Asia, China, Japan, Brazil, and along the African coast. That empire would eventually decline, but it was built on the foundation of caravel technology and the century of advantage it provided. So what happened when the secret finally became common knowledge? How did the democratization of caravel technology reshape the world? The answer is that it triggered the most dramatic and consequential period of global change in human history until the Industrial Revolution. Once multiple European nations possessed ocean-going ships with similar capabilities, the exploration and colonization of the world accelerated dramatically. It wasn't just Portugal anymore. It was Spain, England, France, the Netherlands, and eventually other European powers, all competing for global dominance. The immediate effect was an explosion of exploration. Spanish expeditions, now equipped with capable ocean-going vessels, explored and conquered vast territories in the Americas. Hernán Cortés conquered the Aztec Empire. Francisco Pizarro conquered the Inca Empire. Spanish explorers mapped the Pacific coast of the Americas from California to Chile. English explorers, using ships that incorporated caravel innovations, began their own voyages of discovery. John Cabot explored the North American coast. Francis Drake circumnavigated the globe. English vessels probed the coasts of North America, seeking the Northwest Passage and establishing the first tentative English settlements. French explorers sailed up the St. Lawrence River and into the Great Lakes, claiming vast territories in North America. Dutch explorers reached Indonesia and established what would become a lucrative spice trade empire, rivaling Portugal's. The world was suddenly accessible in a way it had never been before, and multiple European powers were racing to claim whatever they could. The technological spread also transformed naval warfare. In the early days of Portuguese dominance, their superior ships gave them an almost insurmountable advantage in naval combat. By the mid-16th century, multiple nations had comparable vessels, which meant naval warfare became more competitive and more sophisticated. The development of the ship of the line, the galleon, and other large warships, all built on the foundational innovations of the caravel. These ships combined the sailing capabilities pioneered by Portuguese caravels with increased size, heavier armament, and specialized designs for combat. Naval tactics evolved rapidly as commanders learned to use these capable ships effectively. The great naval battles of the Age of Sail, from Lepanto to the Spanish Armada to countless other engagements, were all fought with ships that traced their lineage back to Portuguese caravel innovations. The ability to sail effectively in various wind conditions, to maneuver in combat, and to handle ocean conditions was fundamental to all these vessels. The spread of the technology also had profound economic effects. When Portugal alone controlled the sea route to India, they could charge whatever prices they wanted for spices. Once other nations could sail the same routes, competition increased and prices began to fall. This was bad for Portuguese profits, but good for European consumers and for the broader development of global trade. The establishment of competing European trading empires created a genuinely global economy for the first time. Goods from Asia were traded in Europe, European manufactured goods went to Africa and the Americas, American silver funded trade with China, African slaves were transported to American plantations. It was a horrific system in many ways, built on conquest, slavery, and exploitation, but it was also the first time in history that all inhabited continents were linked in a single economic network. The caravel and its descendants enabled the Columbian exchange, the transfer of plants, animals, diseases, and ideas between the Old World and the New World. Potatoes, tomatoes, corn, and chocolate traveled from the Americas to Europe, Asia, and Africa, fundamentally changing global agriculture and diet. Wheat, rice, horses, and cattle traveled from Europe to the Americas. This biological exchange reshaped ecology and human life on a global scale. Unfortunately, the technology also enabled the Atlantic slave trade on a massive scale. Ships that could reliably cross the Atlantic made it economically feasible to transport enslaved people from Africa to the Americas. This created one of history's greatest humanitarian catastrophes, with millions of people forcibly transported in brutal conditions. The same ships that enabled exploration and trade also enabled this horror. The spread of maritime technology also transformed European politics. Nations with strong navies gained power and influence. England's rise to become a global superpower was built on naval strength. The Netherlands, a small nation, became enormously wealthy and powerful through maritime trade. Spain's vast American empire was connected and controlled through sea power. The competition for maritime dominance drove innovation. Nations invested in better ships, better navigation, better maps, and better naval organization. Royal navies became permanent institutions, professionally organized and equipped. Naval academies trained officers in mathematics, navigation, and tactics. The technology spawned an entire professional ecosystem. By the late 16th and early 17th centuries, European ships were sailing everywhere. They had mapped most of the world's coastlines. They had established colonies on every inhabited continent. They had created trade routes linking Asia, Europe, Africa, and the Americas. The age of European global dominance had begun, and it was built on maritime technology that originated with the Portuguese caravel. But here's what's truly remarkable. The basic sailing principles pioneered by Portuguese caravels remained fundamental to ocean navigation for another 3 centuries. Ships got bigger, more specialized, and more sophisticated, but they still used similar sail configurations, similar hull designs, and similar navigation techniques. The caravel's innovations were so fundamentally sound that they defined ocean sailing, until steam power finally made sails obsolete in the 19th century. Even today, recreational sailboats and traditional sailing vessels use rigging and sail handling techniques that trace directly back to innovations developed for Portuguese caravels. Modern sailors practicing tacking and beating to windward are using skills that Portuguese sailors perfected 500 years ago. The global world we live in today, with its international trade, interconnected economies, and cross-cultural exchange, has its origins in the Age of Discovery. And the Age of Discovery was enabled by Portuguese caravel technology. It's not an exaggeration to say that a ship design developed in small Portuguese shipyards in the early 15th century fundamentally shaped the modern world. From a technological perspective, the caravel represents one of history's most consequential innovations. It ranks alongside the printing press, gunpowder weapons, and agricultural developments in its world historical impact. It made the world smaller and more connected. It enabled the first truly global human civilization. And it all started with Portuguese shipwrights solving a problem that everyone else thought was unsolvable: how to build a ship that could sail anywhere, in any condition, and return safely home. That's the incredible story of Portugal's naval secret, the caravel that changed everything. A small nation on the edge of Europe, driven by necessity and vision, created a technology that transformed the entire world. They guarded that secret for over a century, built an empire on it, and even after the secret spread, the innovations they pioneered continued to shape maritime history for centuries. Think about it. We've just traced a direct line from medieval Portuguese shipyards to the modern globalized world. That's the power of innovation, the importance of technological advantage, and the way a single breakthrough can cascade through history, creating effects that last for centuries. But here's where I need your help. What historical mystery should I uncover next? Are you fascinated by ancient military tactics, medieval engineering marvels, Renaissance scientific breakthroughs, hidden technological innovations that shaped our world? Drop your suggestions in the comments below. I read every single one, and your ideas directly influence what topics I cover next. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into Portuguese maritime history, hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. I create videos like this regularly, uncovering forgotten stories, hidden innovations, and the surprising ways technology has shaped human history. When you subscribe, you're supporting detailed historical research and helping me bring these incredible stories to a wider audience. Don't forget to leave a like if you found this valuable. It helps the algorithm show this video to more people who love history and innovation. And seriously, comment below with your thoughts. Did you know about Portuguese caravels before this video? Were you surprised by how long Portugal kept this technology secret? What other historical technological secrets do you want to learn about? Thanks for watching, thanks for being part of this community of history enthusiasts, and I'll see you in the next video. Until then, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep discovering the amazing hidden stories of our past.